Chapter 3. Comanche, Comanche! Father Conway was different from some of the men of the Texas frontier. He was a devout believer in the Bible and governed all his dealings by what he believed it taught. Every evening at 8 o'clock, just before they went to bed, he called the whole family together. His call included all who were at home and any of the cowhands who were of a mind to come for family prayers. Each evening, in reverent tones that impressed Thad's mind, he read a passage from the Bible. Then, while all present dropped to their knees, he offered a fervent prayer, and to Thad it seemed that Pa knew God was listening. To close, they sang a hymn. The thoughts of confidence expressed in the stately language of the book stirred the boy's soul. The poetry in some passages thrilled him, just as did the thunderstorms and the glowing beauty of autumn. It was the only literature Thad knew at that time, and it filled his thoughts with the awareness of the joy and beauty of creation. Mother Conway had given him all the schooling he had had up to that time. Later, they were to have a school 4 miles away on Fiddleneck Creek for about 3 months each year. Thad's memory was good, so because his mother made him do it, he learned many of the texts Father read in evening worship. For the last 10 days in July one year, a protracted meeting was held on the Conway Double Barrow Ranch. It was a sort of old-fashioned camp meeting. Brother Henson had come from Waco, and word was spread to the ranchers for miles around of his coming. The Conway men put up a brush arbor and made some pole benches, which were not too uncomfortable when padded with quilts. They spread wild hay on the ground under the arbor, and so they had a meeting house. Families came from far and near on horseback and in wagon, prepared to camp out for a week. The menfolk wore guns in their belts, and every saddle boot held a rifle. From early morning until evening, there was preaching and singing. Thad got more out of the association with other boys and girls than he did from the preaching, but the singing satisfied a certain need he felt. Father Conway remarked, "One thing for sure, everybody here is well nourished, both physically and spiritually. What with the beef we barbecue and all the fixins the women make to go with the meat, Preacher Heston gives us the rest of it." There was one thing the preacher said several times in his sermons that worried Thad. "We must love all of God's children," he said. Did that mean Comanches? Thad wondered. After one of these sermons, Thad and Bo listened while a rancher, Leif Allen, about 12 miles over on Blanket Creek, argued hotly with Preacher Heston outside the meeting house. "Brother Heston, are you telling us we've got to love those sneaking, murdering Comanches?" Brother Heston answered quietly, "No, I'm not telling you that. It was Jesus Christ who said, 'Love your enemies, bless them that curse you, and do good to them that hate you, and pray for them which despitefully use you and persecute you.'" Leif Allen shook his head impatiently. "Well, I don't consider that a Comanche is human, and I could never find it in my heart to love one of those rascals." His sentiments were so like Thad's that the boy stood with the other men and boys to listen to the argument. When you get acquainted with a person, any kind of person, when you know his troubles and share his joys and understand his way of thinking, then you can love him, the preacher pointed out. Another rancher, Chet Owen, who had seen his son killed, his house burned, and his cattle stolen by Comanches, said bitterly, "A man would have to overlook a sight of evil and a Comanche to ever get to love him. No more, perhaps, Preacher Heston replied, than the Lord has to overlook in each one of us in order to love us. And the only way I know to put an end to the hate between Indians and white men is for us who know the Lord to pray that both they and we will have His love in our hearts. Thad did not hear the rest of the argument, for at that moment he saw Charlie Binion driving the cows across the creek and into the lot. Come on, Bo, Thad said. Time to milk and get the chores done. The two boys ran to the kitchen, picked up the milking pails, and went to the lot. On the way, Thad said, I'm like Mr. Leif Allen. I could never love a Comanche, and I hate the one who keeps stealing little bits. Late one afternoon, when there was no meeting in progress, Travis said, Let's go coon hunting. Bo and Thad ran for their shotguns, and Thad whistled up old Whistler. Travis called his hunting hounds Bugle and Lady Lou. They set off down the creek, following the dogs. The thought of the Indians at that time of day never entered their minds. They had gone perhaps three-fourths of a mile down the creek, slipping through the brushes on the banks, when the dogs found the track of a coon. Thad knew it was a coon by the way Whistler bayed, just as well as though he had told him in so many words. The dogs were in the creek bed, between banks about 15 feet high. They yelped excitedly, going farther down the creek. The boys hurried after them as fast as they could travel, dropping down into the bed of the creek where the going was easier. There was only a small stream of water in the creek bed, but here and there the roots of some tall old tree, a hole had been washed out by the spring flood, leaving a deep, dark pool of water. They ran at least another quarter of a mile before they came upon the dogs. As they arrived, the coon started to climb the tree, climb the trunk of a tall pecan tree. Whizzer had made one big leap and pulled him down. The dogs were on the coon, the old black fellow in a flash. Fighting them off was the best he could do. The coon plunged into the water. Whizzer hung on for dear life. Thad was not sure, in fact, that Whizzer could have turned loose if he had wanted to, for the coon had sunk his teeth into one dangling ear and was clawing with all 4 feet at his underside. The other dogs had wisely loosed their hold when the coon hit the water. The coon proceeded to drown old Whizzer, and he came near to doing it, too, for the boys could not get in a shot without risking hitting Whizzer. At that last moment, Whizzer, struggling desperately, managed to get loose and ran howling to where Thad was standing. At that moment, Thad became aware of a prickling feeling at the back of his neck. Someone was looking at him from behind. He felt sure. He whirled around, and there on a high bank above were three brown faces, two with remnants of war paint smeared on them. They had been watching the fight between Whizzer and the raccoon, and were laughing heartily. Thad let out a yell. Hey, Indians! The other boys looked and grabbed for their guns. Of the three faces, one in particular was to remain in Thad's memory. The only Indians he had ever seen were a few friendly Tonkawa scouts and the painted Comanches with whom he had fought now and then. They had shown evil-looking faces. This face was the face of a boy, unpainted, laughing at the dog and coon fight, and friendly-looking. For a moment, Thad could have liked him, The others disappeared the instant he had yelled Indians, but that one, still smiling, drew away more slowly. All thought of the raccoon was forgotten. The boys were afoot a mile from home. Since the Indians were on the top of the bluff, they had every advantage. The white boys had no idea how many Indians there were, but the Indians knew the boys' situation exactly. Still, they had been laughing, and they appeared to be no older than Travis and Bo and Thad. But how many more were there back in the woods on the creek bank? Whizzer now went sniffing after the Indians until Thad, fearful of what happened might happen to him, called him back. The three boys waited where they were for half an hour, their packs their backs to the broad trunk of the old pecan tree, but nothing happened. Finally Trav said, "Come on, let's chance it." I think there were just those three boys. Slipping around the creek bank from tree to tree, they reached home about dark and with a story to tell. Indian appearances caused a lot of interest on the frontier, and with good reason. There was hardly a family at the Conway Ranch for the meeting that had not lost at least one member to Comanche raiders. For a while after, the boys took more care about venturing away from home without older companions and without horses. For a while, that is. Lev Buchanan from up on Windy Creek was at the meeting. He had brought his wife, Miss Sally, and their twin grandsons, Timmy and Tommy. The twins' father, Buck Buchanan, and their mother, Miss Laurie, were there too, but the little boys were seldom seen apart from their grandmother. They were as alike as two peas from a pod. Anyone could see that they were the two most important people in Miss Sally's life. The way they followed her about reminded Thad of a doe with twin fawns. But to the young folks, Miss Sally was the most interesting member of the family. Before she was old enough to remember, Miss Sally had been stolen by Comanches. When she was about 8 years old, she had been rescued by rangers after a battle at Possum Springs. She could speak no tongue but Comanche when they found her. No one knew whose young one I was, she told the young folk. I reckon all my family had been massacred at the time of the Comanches at the time the Comanches stole me. So the Rangers gave me to a rancher, Mr. Bill Judson, and his wife to raise. How did you come to get married to Mr. Lev? Bo asked. Oh, old Lev Buchanan was a handwriting for Paul Judson. And when I was 18 years old, we just up and got married, she said. That's all there was to it. Her eyes twinkled when she told them that, and were pretty sure that she had chosen. She could have made quite a story of that. Thad had never seen anyone who enjoyed singing as Miss Sally did. As his father described it, Miss Sally hasn't got a mite of a tune in her, but her way of making music is to pat her foot and throw back her head and squall like a wounded bobcat. Thad decided that was a good description as one could give. Miss Sally was skinny with faded straw-colored hair and wrinkled sunburned skin. The children considered her an old woman, but she was probably not more than 45 or 50 years old. Her husband, Lev, often said, "My wife uses a voice for talking that would do for calling the hogs." Thad and his friends followed her around to listen to stories of her life with the Comanches. She would spit words from the Comanche language at them, and Thad was able to pick up some of their speech in that way. I'll tell you, young ones, she would say, Comanches are just people. Their ways suit them all right, but I like our ways better. But they steal children and treat them mean, Celia said. They steal children, sure enough, Miss Sally replied. But once they get them used to their ways, they just try to make good Comanches of them. They teach them the Comanches are the good folks and white people are the bad ones. Long knives, they call us. Were you glad when the Rangers rescued you? Melissa asked. I'll say not. I fought them tooth and nail. I was all Comanche. That's all I knew. No, I'm afraid. No, I'm not afraid of the Comanches, not a bit. For myself, that is, but for these little ones, I do hope and pray that they'll never get hold of them. They'd make Comanches of them. I've seen it done time and time again. For the first time in months, Thad's older brothers, Reed and Giles, rode in. They were at home for several days of the meetings, but then they had to leave to join their companies of rangers. When the meetings were ended and the people began scattering toward their homes, Thad rode a little bit along the Branson wagon for several miles. Then, as it disappeared into the woods along the creek, he stopped on a little knoll and waved as long as he could see it. The girls and little Stevie waved from the back of the wagon, and Bo waved. He sat for a minute, then galloped after the wagon and out of sight. As Thad was coming in one evening, driving the 4 milk cows from the pasture on the other side of the creek, he heard an owl hoo-hooing softly in the creek bottom. Another answer from below in the woods. Little Bit cocked her ears at the sound, snorted, and pulled at the bit. You hear Indians, Little Bit? He asked her. He had a queer crawling feeling when the calls came again, even though they were a good imitation of the owl's hooting. He was sure they were Indian signals. He hurried the cows along as fast as he could to the milking lot, where he found Travis pitching wild grass hay into the barn loft. There are Indians around, Trav, Thad announced. Travis rumpled his brother's hair and laughed. What makes you think there are Indians around, young'un? Little Bit says so. Besides, there are owls hooting in the woods. Maybe they are owls, Trav argued. But Thad was sure Trav believed him. Uh-huh, Thad said. It's too early in the evening for owls. Besides, a Little Bit always knows when the Indians are around. Better get the saddle horses into the corral and fasten the gate, Travis said. When Father in the Hands, Charlie Young, Ben Atkins, and Tom Weaver came in, they helped make everything as secure as possible. At bedtime, Trav and Thad stepped out onto the back porch to listen. There was no unusual sound, but when they were in their beds, Thad lay with his head in the window so he could hear better. After he had lain there a long time listening, he heard again the hoo-hooing of an owl and the answer. One call came from near the horse barn. Travis heard it too. They got up and put on their breeches and boots. They took their guns in their hands and crept outside. They walked around the house and after a long while went into the corrals. The cows were all in their lot, in the horse in the horse corral. Only Little Bit and Blue Hornet seemed uneasy. The rest of the horses munched placidly. No Indians around now, Travis said. Thad was not so sure, but he followed him back to bed. Before daylight the next morning, the family was getting up and Mother was in the kitchen starting breakfast. Joe Rivers was from 7 miles up on Windy Creek, came pounding into the Conway yards on a winded horse. Mr. Conway, he said, Indians have been riding up our way. They ran off all my riding stock and killed old man Lev Buchanan and scalped him. They must have carried off Miss Sally and those twin young ones of Buck's. What about Buck and Miss Laurie? Mother wanted to know. They they went to Waco a week ago and took the older children. They should be back any day now. Has anyone sent for the Rangers? Father asked. Yes, sir. We sent Charlie Gibson after them, but there's no telling how long it will be before they come. Little Bit and Blue Hornet were telling the truth after all, Travis said. Might as well get into our fighting gear and not wait for Rangers, Father said. We'll help run them down and try to get your horses back. But we can't help poor old Lev Buchanan. Come and get your breakfast before you go, Mother said. Thad was buckling on his gun belt, ready to go out and see about Little Bit and go along on the Indian hunt when his mother said, Now, Thad, you just get any notions about hunting Indians out of your head. Oh, Pa, he wailed. Can't I go along? I'm as good a shot as any man on the place. Yes, son, you are that, his father agreed. But you had better stay here and look after Ma and the stock. Can't tell what we might run into, nor how long we'll be gone. Ben Atkins hurt his game leg when his horse rolled him yesterday, so he'll be here to help. But Ma's as good a shot as any of us, Thad protested. Why do I have to stay at home? No whining now, Thad. Do as I said. Thad knew there was no use begging any more, so keeping his gun belt on, he went out to do the before breakfast chores, milking, watering, and feeding. Hi, a little bit, he called as he approached the lot gate. You sure know you're Indians. I reckon they were just passing us by last night. There was no answering snicker. A little bit was not in the corral nor in the barn. Neither were Blue Hornet or any of the rest of the riding stock. There were several moccasin tracks in the mud beside the watering trough. Little Bit and the other horses had been stolen by the raiding Comanches after all. Thad found where they had got them out of the corral. They had taken the fence apart pole by pole in one place and driven them through. Poor Little Bit, he exclaimed aloud. You hate those Comanches, and now they've got you again. They won't be good to you either. Thad called to his father, Travis, and Ben Atkins. The boy was still talking to the absent Little Bit as he walked around investigating the work of the Comanches when the three menfolk reached the corral. What are you talking to yourself about, young'un? Travis asked jokingly. Tears were flowing down Thad's face, but they were tears of anger and of fear for Little Bit. Comanches, that's what they got, Little Bit. His father was looking around the corral and barn. Looks like the mayor will have company from home, he said. A hoarse whinny from outside the fence attracted their attention. There was old Nick, the mule, with his head over the fence calling to them. An arrow was sticking in his thigh, and a broken rawhide rope dangled from his neck. Nick, you got away from them, Pa Conway said. Might have known you would. If ever an animal was his own boss, it was Nick, the big, raw-boned, long-legged mule. When it suited his fancy to stay in the lot with the other stock, he stayed. When he wanted to go somewhere else, he simply backed off to a far corner, bunched his long legs under his body, and made a run and a jump that took him sailing over the top fence rails. Nick was the smartest worker on the place. Father always said of him, Nick seems to know just what it is you're trying to do when you work him, and he does his best to get it done right. How do you suppose he got away from those Indians? Charlie Bjorn wondered. I wouldn't put it past him to have bitten a chunk out of whatever Comanche was unlucky enough to try to hold him, Travis said. Father laughed. He'd be up to just such as that. I declare to my time, Ben Atkins complained. It's kidding. So a fellow can barely catch a bronc and break him to where he can ride him when along come some of those Comanche varmints and steal him. Now I'm afoot again after I've just spent 3 weeks breaking that old rope-tailed nubbin to the saddle and lariat. Well, it looks as though none of us has a mount outside of old Nick here, and he does his best to work to the wagon or plow, Travis said. We'll have to use him, Father said. Saddle him up, Trav, and see if you can round up some horses from the range that they overlooked. We'll have to go after the murdering horse thieves. They might have Miss Sally Buchanan and those little ones if they haven't already killed them. In an hour or two, Travis came back, driving 8 or 10 of saddle horses ahead of him. The Comanches had not found them. They were holed up in a draw near the rimrock by that little creek. There's a lot of thick growing willow and cottonwood along it, he said. There were saddles enough to go around, and Mother had some jerky and bread and dried fruit, fried pies packed for them by the time they were ready to travel. Thad watched them go while he drowned himself in self-pity. He was past 12, and he thought they should have taken him along. Thad and his mother shared the chores while Ben Atkins looked after the range stock. They got along all right for a couple of days, and then Thad's father came riding home. They were all ears to hear what had happened. We had a hard time finding the trail of Comanches, he told them, but when we finally struck it where several bands had joined and were heading west, I was so worn out that I had to turn back. I'm getting old, I reckon. Too old to ride far and then fight Indians. He sank wearily into his chair beside the fireplace. I see you have some buffalo meat on your saddle, Mr. Conway, Ben Atkins said. He had unsaddled for Father. Yesterday we struck a small bunch of buffalo, Father said. It looked like they had been hunted and were separated from the main herd. I just brought a few ribs and steaks home with me. The fellows needed most of it. They would be running short of rations pretty soon if we hadn't shot this meat. Men from all the ranches for 40 or 50 miles up and down these creeks joined us. They'll put up a battle if they ever catch up with those murderers. They're all stirred up about what Indians did to Lev Buchanan and his family. Tell us about it, Mother said. Mother asked him, did you see any of the Comanches? No, we didn't run into any of them, Father answered. But as I told you, we followed their trail. They had a sight of horses with them, so it wasn't hard to follow. Some rangers joined us near Lost Springs, and they had a couple of Tonkawa scouts with them. But we saw plenty of depredictions the Indians had made. He shook his head sadly. We found a lot of the double bar O cattle slaughtered. They took only the liver and the heart, and a little of the meat from each. They took the hides of some of them too. I don't suppose we can blame them too much for wanting to make the white folk miserable when we're taking their country away from them, Mother remarked. But it's natural for our men to try to wipe them out too. We can live with them peaceably like we do with the Takawas, Miss Louisa Ben Atkins said. If they just would. There's plenty of room for all of us. There is if the Comanches would settle down in one place and work like we do, Pa said. The Comanches have been a plague to all the other tribes since time out of mind, and none of them has any love for a Comanche, though the Kiowas have joined them for their own self-protection at times. 10 days after Father Conway returned, Thad walked yawning early one morning to the milking shed when he heard a low whicker, and there at the gate of the horse corral was Little Bit. She was waiting just as though she had never been away, though she was as disreputable looking as when he had first seen her. He could count her ribs, and she had a sore mouth and a hobble birds burned ankles. She seemed barely able to stand. He shouted for his father and mother to come, and when they went to put his arms around the low mare's neck, father told them that Reed and Giles were among the rangers that had joined the ranchers to fight the Indians, and that when the trouble was over, they would stop at home for a few days. I do hope that will be right soon, mother said. I do miss them so. The Indians seemed to be always a day or two ahead of the white men. They would separate into small bands for a while and then join forces again at some distance. The country out there in western Texas was so vast and empty that hunting a band of Comanches was like looking for a pin in a straw stack. Besides, they had tricks of covering their tracks, such as driving the stock for a long way into water when they came to a stream, or following across a wide, flat country across loose rock and sand, or the constant wind would soon wipe out their tracks. However, early one morning, the rangers and cowmen surprised a small band of Comanches where they were camped around a water hole and almost wiped them out. Those that survived ran away and left the horse herd. One of the white men, Paul Rowlands, from the Turkey Peak country, was hurt quite seriously. The best result of the encounter was that they recaptured a lot of stolen horses, among them a sizable bunch of double bar O stock, both horses and mules. Blue Hornet was among them. Shortly after, the Rangers were called to another part of the country that had suffered depredations. Now that the cowmen had so many of their horses and cattle to drive home, they returned to their ranches. The Conways learned all this from their sons, Travis, Reed, and Giles, and from Charlie Bunyan.